The candidates are coming. A preview of Detroit's Democratic debates. And what matters most to Michigan voters heading into 2020. We'll talk about it. Today is Sunday, July 28, 2019, and this is Flashpoint.
All right, welcome to Flashpoint. It has been a big week in Detroit with the massive NAACP convention in town, and right behind it, another huge week with the Democratic presidential candidates facing off in 2 straight nights of debate from the Fox Theater. It is still an unwieldy mess. 10 candidates at a time, some of whom are fighting for precious pennies to keep the campaign lights on, others hoping to raise millions more than they already have so that they can suffocate the rest of the field. And this week, of course, it comes on the heels of the Robert Mueller appearance on Capitol Hill, which, while not shuffling the deck dramatically, at the very least threw a few more wild cards into the game. And Democrats do seem a little more likely to try to pursue impeachment now that Mueller testified not only that the conditions are right to charge Donald Trump after he leaves office, but also telling Congress that what little testimony the president provided in the investigation was polluted with falsehoods. We're going to talk about Mueller's appearance today. We're also going to set the stage, or perhaps I should say stages, for the debates coming up Wednesday and Tuesday. We're also going to dig into some new polling numbers on where Michiganders stand right now politically. The candidates might want to listen in. For example, most Michiganders do not want to see a Medicare for all health care system. Does that dissuade any of the candidates, or does it suggest an opening for the president, who of course pulled off the big upset win here the last time around? We're going to talk about it all today on Flashpoint. What a week it was, and that's only fair because what a week it is going to be. Let's talk about it this morning with attorney Reggie Turner, who's back with us from Clark Hill, attorney from Plunkett Cooney, and the former mayor of Royal Oak, Dennis Cowan. Columnist from the Detroit Free Press, Nancy Kaffer, is back with us, as is former Republican Congressman from Michigan, Mike Bishop. Thank you all very much for being here. Dennis, I think I want to start with you this morning. I'm not sure what it was interesting reading all the reviews about Robert Mueller's appearance, maybe looking like he was a little bit out of step to some or doddering, but I can't imagine that anybody was going to have their mind changed by anything that happened, as intractable as we are. Did anything change your mind over the past couple of days?
Well, let's not look at the reviews, let's look at the facts. Democrats and the national media promised for 2.5 years, we're going to get Trump, either on collusion or treason or something. Didn't happen. There is no collusion. Then we were promised Mueller's going to come and fix everything. He's going to come to this hearing. He's going to drop the bombshell.
Are you dancing through the end zone?
And it didn't happen. It didn't happen. This reminded me of the emergency room with Mueller as the doctor and the last gasp with the paddles to breathe life into the dead cadaver of impeachment. The Democrats don't know it. Impeachment is dead. America's moving on. What America wants, what Michigan wants is Congress get to work. Do something about the Dreamers. Do something about the American Free Trade Act, which will help and replace NAFTA, help workers and the auto industry. Let's get back to work.
Reggie, I'm not sure Jerry Nadler thinks impeachment is dead.
Well, I think my dear friend Dennis doth protest too much. In this situation, there should be a lengthy investigation. This thing will play out over the course of time. It is not over. I think the congressional investigation will go on. I think Nancy Pelosi is taking the right approach by not seeking to move toward impeachment too fast before there is sufficient evidence to ensure that that these proceedings would be worthwhile. Our country is in a period of great division. The internet is a wonderful thing, except when it isn't. And when we grew up, there was an old saying that you could have your own opinion, but you can't have your own facts.
Yeah.
In the 21st century, many people have their own facts, and they use the internet as a way to put information out that, in many cases, is just flat wrong.
Nancy, we have to be careful. We're very surrounded by attorneys. In fact, you and I may be being billed by the hour right now and don't know it. I just keep coming. I thought going in and I thought coming out. No one's mind is ever seeming to even see the potential for change. Everybody is where they are. Doesn't matter what they hear on a weekly basis.
I think you're exactly right. I think everyone who thought that the report was bad for the president going in feels the same way, and everyone who thought that it completely vindicated him, despite the actual words that it says, is still going to feel that way. But we had to have these long hearings about what's in a report that anyone can read because no one has read it. So, I mean, there's not really a lot of, you don't really have to draw conclusions. I mean, the man wrote a lot of things about the lack of availability of information, the importance of preserving this information while memories are still fresh in case a future legal team decides to do something with it. He wrote that the president wasn't exonerated. But again, no one is going to have a different opinion on that after those hearings. I agree.
Mike, if the president is open for prosecution later, does that mean then that it should just be left alone now? Or do you let somebody who seems to be on the hook for some sort of criminality just continue to be president, I guess?
Well, that requires a lot of speculation on my part. That facts.
That's what I guess I'm trying to engender.
We don't know.
Yes. Are you ready to
There's a lot of talk as to whether or not Mueller had this obligation to exonerate the president. He's got no such obligation. The president and anybody who goes through a process like this in our American jurisprudence system has the position of being innocent until proven guilty. And this process has really been turned on its head.
But isn't that the nature of being president? I mean, it's already unusual that going in, he knew that he couldn't prosecute. He couldn't indict anyone because of a law against doing that for a president, not a law, a policy, I should say. So isn't it by definition already not the same as it would be if they were investigating you or me?
It didn't prohibit Mueller from putting facts in the report that would get to the point of charging him with a crime or elements of a crime. And really, there wasn't anything in the report to get to that level. And that was the whole point of the investigation. 2 years it took to come up with really nothing that they can hang their hat on in terms of future prosecution. And I think it's a mistake for
I don't
us
think
to
Robert Mueller sees it that way.
Well, I don't know what Mueller sees, because he seems to have not read his own report. It didn't appear that way anyway. He was not familiar with the facts and was not familiar with what his investigation concluded.
See how everybody's doing the same points that they would have said last week if you would have asked them how the hearings were going to go?
It doesn't matter, does it?
Right.
But that's the point. Why have the hearing at all?
Well, he clearly didn't want to.
Right.
That's part of why he did not want to be there. But Dennis, as points of law, as I am speaking to an attorney, for the president to have, according to Robert Mueller, basically lied to him in what testimony he did provide, is that not problematic? As is the not reluctance, but the outright obstinance of the White House to not allow anyone to testify and answer to these subpoenas that have been coming from Congress.
Right, and that's after the White House and the Trump, the businesses and also the campaign gave 1.4 million documents. There were 500 interviews. This is not any obstruction to stop the Mueller investigation. In fact, Mueller said he was not obstructed. What this is to fight with respect to the, with respect to the, he never complained that he was being obstructed to anybody. And he did a complete, thorough investigation. That's what that report is supposed to represent. And let's remember one other thing that's going on. The second phase of this is going to start. The Inspector General's report is supposed to come out. We have Prosecutor Durham in the Connecticut with the grand jury who is starting to investigate some of the things that happened. I said weeks ago on this show, there are many strange things that happen in this between the FBI, between the DOJ, and I think at the end of the day we're going to get to the bottom of it.
Basic question that I've had since the start. If there was nothing untoward, why were so many lies told about who met with Russians and when? From the top down, it went on and on and on. If there was nothing untoward about it, why lie about it?
Well, the question is, you want to get to the base of criminality. And Mueller said the other day, he did not make a determination about criminality. And look at, with who he had on his staff, all the pro-Clintonistas who were on that staff, believe me, if they had found a way to get criminality into this with the obstruction, they would have done it. Let's remember, and I've talked to prosecutors about this, most prosecutors I've talked to said they were, on both sides of the aisle, said on an obstruction with the president, they'd rather have Trump's case than the prosecution's case.
But Reggie, to Dennis's point then, isn't it time to just raise the flag on this? We're in an election cycle right now. Move on.
Well, I disagree with Dennis's point with regard to the falsehoods that Mueller reported. In fact, it seems to me that lying in a federal investigation is obstruction of justice. And accordingly, I think that there is even more of a basis, essentially, to continue to investigate Mr. Trump on the basis of the fact that he did not tell the truth in the investigation.
I got to get to a quick break. When we come back, we'll start setting the stage for the Democrats, all 20 of them, heading into Detroit this next week. This is Flashpoint on Local 4.